Hey guys, tonight we begin with the forgotten ghost ships of the Spanish Armada. Vessels lost to storms and swallowed by the sea. Their fates scattered like driftwood across the shores of Ireland and Scotland. But before we start, comment down below where you're listening from and what time it is for you. What if I told you that a single piece of wood could hold the secrets of one of the greatest naval disasters in history? Stick around to uncover the journey of an admiral's oak table, crafted with care, lost to the sea, and now a silent witness to the shipwrecks of the Spanish Armada. Imagine a storm so fierce it could unravel years of planning, ruin an empire's ambitions, and leave behind only broken ships and unanswered questions. That's exactly what unfolded in the late summer months of 1588 as the proud Spanish Armada, designed to dominate the seas, found itself caught in the relentless embrace of nature's wrath. This wasn't your average thunderstorm lingering over the horizon. The skies turned leaden, the wind screamed across the waves, and the sea itself seemed to rise up in rebellion. Perhaps even the most skilled sailor couldn't help but wonder if God or fate had intervened to humble one of the mightiest fleets ever assembled. Picture this: more than 130 ships, all sailing on a vast mission of conquest. The Armada wasn't just a fleet. It was a moving city filled with soldiers, priests, sailors, and supplies. It carried enough artillery to darken the skies over England, its purpose clear: to topple the Protestant power of Elizabeth I and restore Catholic dominance across the English Channel. But to reach England, the Armada needed to follow a precise course. Everything depended on skillful navigation and disciplined formation. In reality, the Armada was at the mercy of the sea. As they crept northward, the winds began their taunt. Just a breeze at first, strange but not necessarily alarming. Commanders adjusted their sails and clung to hope. But by the time the storms truly struck, hope had little place here. Waves surged higher than the tallest masts, thrashing the wooden hulls like paper boats. By then, everything on deck, barrels, cannons, even men, was flung about with merciless force. Orders shouted from the higher decks were immediately gobbled up by the roar of the sea. Lanterns swung wildly in the spray, their feeble glow barely visible through the chaos. It was as if even the surrounding sky decided to conspire with the ocean, swallowing light and plunging the fleet into endless grey chaos. The Armada scattered in every direction. Its finely tuned formation shattered beyond hope. Commanders on individual ships fought to control their vessels, but faced a brutal choice. Some tried to steer towards familiar waters, hoping to land somewhere along Spain or France's coastline, praying for shelter. Others simply succumbed to the storm's randomness, their ships wandering wherever the waves dragged them. Navigation, already tricky in the best of conditions, became nearly impossible. The compasses spun aimlessly, helpless against the tremors vibrating through the decks each time a wave slammed into the hull. The stars, once reliable guides for mariners, hid behind a blackened, boiling sky. The next few hours, or perhaps it was days, time seemed slippery here, were marked by scenes of desperation. On certain ships, some of the younger sailors muttered quick prayers through chattering teeth, their hands gripping whatever sturdy railing they could find. Others kept silent, conserving energy or numbing themselves to the fate they felt tightening around them. Food supplies became soaked. Salt water sloshing even into the barrels meant for fresh drinking water. Meanwhile, the captains, perhaps worse off than anyone, had to shoulder the weight of impossible decisions while their commands went unheard in the unending cacophony. Wooden planks bent and groaned as though alive, some breaking off entirely with ominous cracks. In those moments, the giant fleet no longer looked like a dominating military force. It looked breakable. And when the winds finally recoiled, their ferocity seeming to retreat after hours or days of torment, what followed wasn't solace. It was the kind of eerie calm that left no room for relief. Water trickled from smashed hulls, sails hung lifelessly in shreds, and the air was heavy, not with victory, but with exhaustion and dread. One by one, the sailors pulled themselves up to see where they had ended up. For some, it was land too far to identify. Beaches of jagged stones or steep cliffs loomed like unforgiving sentinels. Others found nothing but open water in every direction. Their small crew and broken vessel, the only evidence left of their mission's original scale. It's important to understand just how violent these storms were. Recorded as some of the worst weather patterns of the late 16th century, they were driven by the tumultuous climate systems over the North Atlantic. The year itself had already been marked by unpredictable conditions. Farmers had reported catastrophic rains earlier that spring, and sailors along the coast warned of something eerie filling the horizon. It wasn't uncommon for weather to be swift and unforgiving in these waters. But what struck the Armada fleet verged on apocalyptic. Historians speculate that the fleet wound up facing multiple overlapping systems. Terrible bursts of cold air driving waves as high as 20 feet into the heavens, followed by downdrafts strong enough to capsize smaller vessels outright. Captains and navigators documented these gales extensively after the few who survived made it back to Spain. They wrote of howling blackness and waters that behaved like angry beasts, words meant to convey terrors for which they had no real precedent. Days after the storm's fiercest blows, wreckage began to litter shores, mainly along the western stretch of Ireland and parts of Scotland. Here, along these remote coastlines, the Armada left behind its first ghostly calling cards. Shards of shattered hulls, bits of rigging tangled among seaweed, and tragically, bodies washed ashore, their faces turned ashen beneath the shadows of cliffside mists. Onlookers in nearby Irish villages found themselves unsure of how to react. For some communities, English rule's harsh restrictions made aiding Spanish sailors a dicey proposition. Others, weighed down by their own poverty, could do little more than murmur a prayer before retreating to their cottages as the tide rolled in once again. And yet, part of the Armada's fate remained hidden, unsolved. For while some ships clearly perished on these sharp-edged shores, many were simply swallowed into watery silence. They became the first of the so-called ghost ships of that haunting campaign. Vessels that were seen for a brief moment before vanishing forever, or merely leaving legends of their inexplicable endings behind. Sailors, it is said, wrote heartfelt farewells into their journals before huge swells claimed their ships. Imagine these written pleas, slashed in desperation, floating inside letters that would never make landfall. The loss of these ships was more than a strategic failure. It marked the moment when the Armada turned from conquest to survival, whether hailed as divine judgment or chalked up to raw miscalculation. the storm left a trail of mystery in its wake. These waters, now teemed with secrets, peculiar chlorophyll, had been found clinging to wreckage blades, a sign of violent turbulence deep underwater. Harsh weather like this didn't only strike the surface after all. Every gust above was mirrored by entwining currents that wrestled below. But here's where things get truly interesting. What was once evidence of calamity, the scattered remains of an overzealous fleet, turned over generations into whispers of intrigue. These so-called ghost ships didn't all disappear. As we'll explore in upcoming moments, some parts of their story survived, whether in fragments of timber clinging to rocky headlands or items improbably pulled from the ocean depths centuries later. In short, it's here, across these treacherous coasts, that history began shifting from the historical to the legendary. And for would-be adventurers, relic hunters, or just anyone who's imagined a corroded anchor half buried in the sand, this is where the Armada's story first starts calling like the haunting toll of a distant bell. What came next for those fractured remains, and who would be brave or foolhardy enough to try and rebuild a narrative from its wreckage? Let's drift now towards one specific piece, one of the rare, tangible remnants to outlast the waves, sailors, and centuries themselves. And with it, we'll glimpse how fleeting victories, like fleeting ships, can somehow find renewed life by making it ashore. What stories lie buried beneath the sands of Spanish Point? The name itself tells you as much as it hides. Spanish Point, tucked along the wind-swept coast of County Clare, Ireland, carries within it the echoes of an almost forgotten tragedy. Here, the restless waves hint at something deeper, something heavier, just beneath their surface. A legacy of desperation, loss, and survival tied to the wreckage of the Spanish Armada. To anyone passing through today, it might just seem like a beautiful, rugged coastline. The grassy cliffs curve gently towards the horizon, often cloaked in soft silver fog. You might hear the rhythmic crash of water against stone or see seabirds swirl and wheel above the endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, their cries high and plaintive. But the stillness of the place, the sense of timeless melancholy in every gust of wind, will make you wonder. If you stand very still, maybe you'll even imagine the faintest murmur of something left behind. In 1588, Spanish Point was no quiet sanctuary. It was chaos. The Armada, scattered and broken by unrelenting storms, forced many ships toward Ireland's west coast, where their voyage would end brutally. Some of these vessels scraped desperately toward the shoreline, their crews fighting not for Spain, but for survival. The jagged rocks that lined this coastline offered no welcome, only destruction. Ships splintered and shattered on impact. These proud vessels, built to carry Spain's hopes of conquering its heresy across the sea, became nothing more than wreckage, reduced to driftwood gnawed apart by the currents. The drowned sailors washed ashore in droves, their lives and cause swept away like sea foam disappearing under a wave. There's a particular spot here, known as Tomple Naspanig. The phrase translates to the burial place of the Spaniards, a modest but powerful marker of how the people of this region processed what happened, for a place that's never truly been free of the sea's influence. Perhaps no other event etched itself so deeply into the landscape's identity. If you walk along the cliffs here, you can almost feel it. this idea that the place itself remembers. The Spanish sailors who died here had no great sweeping memorial of marble sculptures or plaques. Instead, they were carried on shore, their bodies weathered but intact, only to be lowered into simple graves. It's not difficult to imagine how this might have played out centuries ago. Picture locals from nearby villages gathering when the tide retreated, confronting a pile of bodies, foreign strangers, strewn across their rocky beaches. The air would have carried the overwhelming sting of salt, seaweed, and decay, mingling with the quiet rustle of morning prayers said by those brave enough to stay and bury the dead. And yet, amidst this solemn task, there are whispers of tension within their grief. While the locals may have wanted to honor the dead, there's little doubt that fear also lingered. Ireland was under strict English rule at the time, and showing sympathy to Spanish sailors could have been seen as defiance against the crown. Helping could get you into serious trouble. So even in death, these sailors represented a risk for those who cared enough to pull them from the waves and offer some dignity. Still, Tampal Naspanig endures as a reminder that some people, despite everything, chose compassion over fear. A graveyard by the sea. No names, no grand inscriptions. Just a place of final rest beneath the windswept grass. Standing there today, it's hard to reconcile the peacefulness with what must have unfolded centuries ago. The waves lap steadily, their rhythm almost meditative, shushing against rock and sand in a way that might lull you if you stayed long enough. And yet this is the very rhythm that once carried shattered beams, drowned men, and the debris of a mighty empire to shore. It's said that pieces of the Armada's ships, timbers heavy with salt and history, were collected here by local villagers. The rotting wood, blackened by seawater, might have seemed like a grim token of the disaster at first. But practicality tends to win out in times of hardship. Any material, even remnants of an empire's downfall, could find new life. These fragments, dragged from the shoreline, were repurposed to build homes, churches, even tools. In this way, the Armada literally became part of the land it once sought to conquer. The villagers were never far from the ocean or those memories. Generations later, haunting tales of the wreckage persisted. It's said the ruins of Kilailah Parish, near Spanish Point, still carry the ghosts of Spanish sailors who perished here. Like shadows cut loose from their owners, these spectral figures are rumored to wander the area, restless and untethered. A quiet reminder of lives lost to the brutal indifference of the sea. There's no way of verifying such haunting whispers. Or perhaps it's better not to try. Local folklore and oral history gave these tales a kind of permanence, long before anyone thought to write them down. They wove stories of survivors who made their way ashore only to face grim fates. Some of the Spaniards were said to have been hanged, their corpses buried without dignity, far from Tampal Naspanig. Legend claims their cries near Kilailah can still stitch themselves into the rushing wind late at night, a warning heard only by those ready to hear it. But for all the mystery surrounding Spanish Point, it wasn't just fragments of hulls or faint whispers of ghosts to emerge from the wreckage. There were objects, unmistakably shaped by the hands of craftsmen and sailors. One of those objects, a single elegant artifact, would bridge the lives lost here and the stories carried forward. An oak table, heavy and regal, its surface bore the markings of intricate carvings and the faint grooves worn away by time. Known today as the Admiral's Oak Table, it was once a piece of a commander's quarters aboard one of the Armada's ships. Its sheer survival is remarkable. It should have been smashed alongside the beams that held the fleet together, scattered into untraceable fragments sinking beneath the Atlantic. Yet something about its dense craftsmanship, or perhaps its shape, allowed it to be pulled from the wreckage intact. This table, though silent and unassuming, held its own kind of story. Its journey began scattered on these Irish shores. Villagers quickly realized its worth, not just as a sturdy piece of furniture, but as a symbol of something larger. Unlike the scraps of wood repurposed for cottages or fences, the table stood distinct, something that demanded preservation. Perhaps this was because it carried the aura of authority, the air of something used in grand planning or discussion. It's fascinating, isn't it, to think about how something as ordinary as a table, 4 legs and smooth wood, could mean so much in the right context. From the rugged coastlines of Spanish Point to its eventual salvation by local hands, its journey was far from over. The table story was just beginning, even as the Armada's tale was on the verge of slipping into legend. And as we turn to follow it, moving past this coastline and into the hands of those who preserved it, there's a quiet truth taking shape. The Admiral's Oak Table wasn't just an artifact or relic. It became a rare fragment of memory, bridging the weight of one country's loss with another's historical curiosity. It stands now, centuries later, accommodating silent observers who might run their hands along its carved edges and wonder at what it's seen. So, looking back at the sands of Spanish Point, you can feel the weight of everything that's worked its way into the wind and waves. The physical wrecks of the Spanish Armada may have scattered, but their presence remains undeniable. Perhaps it's in the faint songs of the breeze, the cries of seabirds, or the way the horizon stretches endlessly beyond, giving an odd sense of finality to those who stare too long. As we follow the journey of this singular table, dredged from the fate that swallowed so much else, it gives us a chance, just briefly, to hold on to something the sea could not claim. How does something as ordinary as a table become a witness to history? That's the question that lingers when you hear about the Admiral's Oak Table, a piece that somehow survived shipwreck, storm-tossed waters, and centuries of change. Imagine it. A sturdy, elegant construction pulled from the wreckage of a Spanish Armada vessel, its once proud craftsmanship still intact, even though everything around it had been destroyed. It's the kind of artifact that seems to hold a quiet story within its smooth surfaces, carved legs, and solid weight. A piece of the past that feels tangible in a way no old legend or ship log could ever quite manage. This wasn't just any table. It had a commanding presence, carefully crafted to match the wealth and rank of its original owner. Furniture like this wasn't for common sailors. It was meant for high-ranking officers or nobles, perhaps even the Admiral himself. The oak used to build it would have been solid and dense, chosen less for practicality and more for the weight of prestige it brought. The tabletop had a rich finish, the kind that would have gleamed under lamplight back in its day, softened by the polished touch of hands sorting papers, laying plans, or lifting a goblet of wine. If you ran your fingertips along its edges now, you'd probably feel the faint indentations of age, a slight irreplaceable texture. But back then, it was the picture of refinement. smooth and unyielding, a solid anchor amid the cramped chaos of life aboard a warship. The details deserve a moment, don't they? You could stop and imagine the table's legs, intricate carvings that hinted at the artistry of the craftsmen who made them. According to historical descriptions, the legs ended in claws that curled delicately, perhaps mimicking the talons of some fierce bird, though softened by the flowing elegance of the carved shapes. These were deliberate touches, reflecting not just skill, but intention. Whoever owned this table wanted it to be noticed. It wasn't just furniture. It was a statement. That's what makes it so fascinating. Even when it was built, it wasn't only about utility. It was about showing you belonged to a certain class. It carried authority, even among the din and sweat of a naval campaign. And yet, here's a strange thing to consider. How out of place something like that must have seemed on a ship battered by open sea. The Spanish Armada wasn't a pleasure cruise. It was a lethal living machine, carrying soldiers and sailors packed in dense rows, stacked with provisions and weaponry. Every inch of space used to sustain the fleet's mission. For all its neat carvings and polished surfaces, the table must have stood as an odd contrast to the rough, functional designs of the rest of the ship. You almost have to picture it. A room built around the kind of dignity this table exuded. Walls cramped but clean, with maps rolled neatly on a shelf, a brass sextant on a nearby desk. It's likely this table was the centerpiece of its surroundings, the physical heart of a command room where decisions were made and lives were changed in the tumult of battle planning. Those who sat at it were no doubt men of station, accustomed to the quiet ceremony that comes with command. Most likely, the admiral or his closest advisors would lean over it, poring over maps of distant coasts and unfriendly waters. Men of these ranks were not so different from their tables in a way. Polished, deliberate, carefully constructed to reflect dignity and authority. The table added to the weight of their presence, not just because of its craftsmanship, but because of what it symbolized. It was an object through which decisions flowed, where plans were drawn up, alliances were discussed, and perhaps orders were quietly issued that would shape the fate of nations. Off the windswept shores of County Clare, in a small but vital patch of land near Spanish Point, lived a man named Boetius Clancy. Not a famous man, nor a high-ranking one in the larger scheme of things, but someone whose story lingers quietly in the margins of history. In his time, Clancy was known as the inheritor of the place, a title that suggests not wealth or status, but rather a deep connection to the land he called home. He belonged to the tangled fabric of life along Ireland's rugged coastline, where survival often depended on the whims of the sea and how well you could read them. Clancy wasn't just a passive observer of the disasters that befell the Spanish Armada. He was deeply rooted in the aftermath, not out of duty or obligation, but because his home placed him at the heart of the chaos. His land sat dangerously close to where many of the Armada's ill-fated ships met their grim conclusions, their splintered remains scattered like seeds across the jagged rocks and sandy coves. The sight of wreckage must have been common along these shores back then, but the sheer scale of destruction following the Armada was likely unlike anything Clancy and the rest of his community had ever encountered. Imagine that moment, stepping out past the cliffs in the early dawn light, hearing the low hiss of morning waves and spotting the twisted shapes of timbers wedged into the rocks like strange broken sculptures. You could almost feel the weight of what had washed ashore. Not just wood or rope or provisions, but the wreckage of ambition itself. Among those fragments, Clancy found something remarkable. Not cannons, ornaments, or weapons, but a simple table. Or maybe simple isn't quite the word for the Admiral's oak table. It was a piece of curious workmanship, as some would later describe it, bearing intricate carvings and clawed feet that spoke to someone's deliberate care and steady skill. It stood apart from the usual maritime debris, almost as if it had carried a quiet defiance through the storm. Why would a man like Clancy choose to preserve a table? After all, the coast's other inhabitants had their own way of handling shipwrecks, out of necessity, not sentiment. Salvaging wasn't just a matter of survival. It was an unspoken tradition, almost instinctive. Strips of soaked timber became roofing. Smashed planks were nailed into fences, and whatever commodities could be pried from the wrecks were pocketed as compensation from the unfeeling sea. For a community mostly at the mercy of harsh weather, these remnants weren't relics. They were resources. But this table was different. Clancy seemed to see past the practicality of it. He must have noticed the fine craftsmanship, the weight of its form, or perhaps even something symbolic tucked within its battered state. It was, at its heart, a fragment of a tragedy far larger than the coastline that had claimed it. Unlike the usable scraps of rigging or the barrels laden with spoiled provisions, the table carried a certain timelessness, as if it had somehow absorbed the dignity of those it once served. Maybe it had once stood in a quiet corner of the Admiral's quarters, a witness to intense conversations and whispered strategies, a hushed observer of pride and power that, like the Armada itself, was eventually humbled by nature. To Clancy, it must have felt worth saving. Clancy's world, though rooted along the cliffs and coves of Clare, was one of complicated loyalties and layered histories. His family's connections to the region stretched back generations, tying them not just to the land, but to the events that regularly shaped its story. The Spanish Armada's wreckage wasn't just a distant tale carried across Ireland. It was a catastrophe, literally tossed at the feet of villagers like Clancy. And yet, salvaging what remained went beyond necessity for people like him. It was also about tying their existence to something larger, preserving a story in fragments, even as the rest of the world moved past it. In the case of the Admiral's table, his decision reveals a certain care that isn't always visible in historical records. It wasn't merely wood to him. It was something worth keeping intact. Not broken down into scraps, not burnt for warmth, but preserved as it was. You can almost picture the moment he might have heaved the waterlogged oak out of the shallows, noting the impressive weight and design that separated it from the dozens of other ordinary objects scattered around it. Its salvaging wasn't careless work, but deliberate, the kind of act that makes you pause and consider how stories survive long after events end. Once above the relentless reach of the tide, the table became a part of Clancy's world. It moved from the chaos of Spanish Point to his home, a simple but important shift. Sitting in his modest surroundings, the table might have seemed, at first, an awkward fit. Its intricate carvings, those curved legs ending in talon-like feet, likely stood out against more practical furnishings. But the table didn't diminish for its new setting. It adapted. What had once been a centerpiece for the plans of commanders became something quieter, an artifact waiting for its next chapter. For Clancy, though, the table wasn't just an object to admire. It became a familial treasure, almost without plan, passed carefully through his connections. In time, Clancy gifted the table to his brother-in-law, Connor O'Brien, a gesture that ensured its story would continue and that it would remain safely within the care of those who valued its history. This act feels deliberate, doesn't it? It speaks of a decision, not just to hold on to the past, but to make sure the past doesn't disappear entirely. Perhaps Clancy knew he had saved something rare and important, something worth sharing but never losing, even through changing hands. It's worth considering what this gesture says about him too. O'Brien wasn't just any relation. He came from the powerful O'Brien family of County Clare, descendants of Irish royalty who had long maintained influence in the region. In gifting the table to O'Brien, Clancy wasn't simply passing along a piece of furniture. He was ensuring that it would be preserved by someone with the means to care for it. Someone who'd understand its tie to the land and its place in the larger story of the Armada. This transfer wasn't about letting go. It was about safeguarding what had already been salvaged. Salvaging shipwrecks, after all, was deeply symbolic, especially when it came to the Spanish Armada. The wrecks at Spanish Point weren't just debris. They were echoes of a larger struggle, reminders of Spain's failed ambition and the lives lost in its wake. By pulling something from those ruins, Clancy wasn't just repurposing materials. He was claiming a piece of the larger story for his community. It's a reminder of how shipwrecks blur the line between the practical and the meaningful. For some, they were a source of survival. For others, they became a way to connect to something vast and intangible, the fleeting presence of history washing up at their doorstep. And so, the table began its journey through time, its significance shifting and reshaping as it passed from one guardian to another. From the storm-shattered coast to Clancy's home, and then into the care of O'Brien. It moved steadily, always handled by those who saw its worth beyond its immediate use. It survived not just because of its craftsmanship, but because someone decided it was worth protecting, worth holding on to, worth passing down. The table, once a tool of strategy and war, slowed its purpose to something quieter. A keeper of personal histories, reminders, and connections. Eventually, its new home and new guardian would carry it even further, landing it in one of the most prominent homes in Clare. But before we follow it into the halls of Dromoland House, let's pause here for a moment to appreciate the quiet, deliberate care that saved it in the first place. Without Clancy's decision, not just to pluck the table from the wreckage, but to pass it on, this story, like so many of the Armadas, might have dissolved back into the salt and wind. But that's not what happened. Instead, the Admiral's table endured, saved by one man who saw something in its form, then carried forward by others who kept that vision alive. And as we head next into Dromoland's stately halls, we'll uncover how this seemingly ordinary artifact became more than just a piece of maritime salvage. It became a bridge between worlds, an artifact shaped by survival, and a reminder that history, in its quietest forms, has a way of persisting when you least expect it. Dromoland House is not the kind of place you stumble upon accidentally. It rises, stately and deliberate, from the lush hills of County Clare Island, its grey stonework and turreted walls, more at home with grandeur than the quiet villages dotting the coastline nearby. It's a sharp contrast to the windswept cliffs and rocky coves where the Spanish Armada's ships met their fates. Yet, in the grand halls of this elegant manor, far removed from the crashing waves and the brutal chaos of a 16th century storm, sits an artifact that once belonged to that weathered, sea-battered world. The Admiral's oak table. It's almost hard to imagine the table here at first. Dromoland's polished floors reflect the soft glow of chandeliers, and sunlight filters through tall, arched windows, casting long golden beams across rooms filled with tapestries, delicate porcelain, and oil portraits in gilded frames. Every corner of the house seems curated, designed to showcase elegance and nobility, losing no opportunity to remind visitors that this is a place with a deep and honorable lineage. The Admiral's table, with its clawed legs and intricate carvings, certainly fits the surroundings in its way. At first glance, it might not stand out. You see a grand wooden table and think that's exactly the sort of thing a manor like this should have. But its journey to Dromoland House, from a shattered Spanish ship to this quiet corner of Irish luxury, makes it far more than just another piece of antique furniture. Dromoland House wasn't always the bustling luxury getaway it is today. In the 16th century, it was the seat of the O'Brien family, local landowners with strong ties to the landscape and its history. The O'Briens weren't just any Irish family. They traced their lineage back to Brian Boru, the legendary High King of Ireland who famously defeated the Vikings at the Battle of Clontarf. That connection to greatness wasn't just about family pride. It rooted the O'Briens to the land in an enduring way. This family had a sense of continuity, a belief that their history was sown into the soil, the cliffs, and yes, even the coastline that shaped Clare's quiet fishing communities. The table's arrival at Dromoland came through Conor O'Brien, to whom Boetius Clancy had entrusted this artifact from the wreckage of the Armada. It must have been a deliberate and thoughtful gift. Clancy didn't choose just anyone. He chose Conor, a man with the influence and means to preserve such an important piece of history. That act alone speaks volumes about Clancy's understanding of what the table represented. It wasn't just valuable because of its craftsmanship or its practical use. It carried significance. It had survived one of the great naval disasters of its age, and now embodied both the fragility of human ambition and the resilience of what's crafted by careful hands. Placing it in the care of the O'Brien family fortified its legacy. Within the halls of Dromoland, it wouldn't be broken down or cast aside. It would endure. Conor O'Brien, like the rest of the family, must have recognized the table's story. By the time it arrived at Dromoland, its days of being a tool of navigation or a resting place for wine goblets on stormy seas were long gone. It wouldn't again feel the rocking of a hull or the spray of salt water. Instead, the table would settle into an entirely new rhythm, a silent witness to the refined life of an Irish estate. Picture it placed carefully in one of the manor's many rooms, its delicate carvings catching the soft light of a roaring fire as guests drank wine or discussed local affairs. It became art, history, and utility wrapped into one. The sheer contrast between its origins aboard a Spanish warship and its new home in a stately Irish manor is impossible to ignore. The ship it originally graced was a war machine, a floating fortress filled with the hum of preparation, the metallic scrape of swords being sharpened, and the relentless thud of boots pacing back and forth on wooden decks. It was built to conquer, its purpose soaked in ambition, but its failure, like the failure of the Armada, turned the table's journey inward. Here at Dromoland, that sense of grandeur shifted into stillness. In the quiet of the manor, it was no longer surrounded by chaos, but by stately order. The deep green hues of velvet drapes, the fragrant presence of freshly cut flowers in crystal vases, and the measured tones of conversation echoing off stone walls. It's easy to imagine how time bent differently for the table in this new setting. In the command quarters of the Admiral's ship, its life would have been punctuated by urgency. The hurried scratching of quills across parchment, the echo of shouted orders, and the constant presence of fear beneath it all. On the other hand, Dromoland's halls would have introduced a steadier rhythm, one defined by the turning of seasons and slow, deliberate moments. The table absorbed its surroundings quietly, its clawed feet now resting firmly on dry ground and polished floors rather than the shifting, swaying world of the open sea. The O'Brien family's care for the table mirrored their broader interest in preserving history. The Admiral's oak table wasn't the only artifact within their home connecting them to the past. Dromoland was more than a residence. It was a repository of memory. Everything, from its architecture to the objects collected and displayed within its walls, reflected the family's deep ties to Ireland's complex story. The table joined that lineage, not just as a relic of the Spanish Armada, but as a reminder of how history can physically manifest in the objects we choose to protect. There's something striking about the table's survival in this context. It didn't just endure the immediate aftermath of the crash. It outlasted centuries of change, upheaval, and shifting societal priorities. Dromoland itself was no stranger to change. The house evolved across generations, representing not only the wealth and influence of the O'Brien family, but also their gradual adaptation to modern Ireland. And through it all, the table remained, quietly bearing the weight of its story, without complaint or ceremony. We don't know exactly how the table was used in Dromoland House, but we can guess. Perhaps it occupied a prominent space in the library, where its sturdy surface held leather-bound books and personal correspondence sealed with wax stamps. Or maybe it was moved into a study, surrounded by the faint smell of ink and softened by the gentle ticking of a clock in the corner. Wherever it stood, it must have drawn curiosity from time to time. Imagine guests leaning forward after hearing its origin story, running their hands over the carvings and wondering idly about the men who once sat around it as waves pounded against the hull of their ship. The table, silent and solid, may not offer answers, but its presence leaves plenty of space for imagination. It's fitting, in a way, that the table found itself at Dromoland. The manor's grandeur couldn't erase its simpler origins, nor could its refinement mute the sense of weathered resilience etched into its surface. If anything, the contrast only amplified the breadth of its journey. From a Spanish warship to a remote Irish coastline, from the hands of a pragmatic salvager to a noble family's stately home. It's a narrative that moves from tumult to tranquility, following the slow curve of history itself. But of course, the story doesn't stop there. The Admiral's oak table, despite its elevated status as an artifact, never stopped being exactly what it was. A table, a piece of wood built for the mundane acts of everyday life, transformed into something deeper, simply because it survived where so much else didn't. Dromoland gave it shelter, a final resting place steeped in history and care. It connected the O'Briens not just to Spanish Point, but to the larger story of the Armada and its mysterious remnants. A bridge between a household's legacy and the sea's unwritten tales. As the years pressed forward, the table remained. It endured shifts in ownership, sweeping societal changes across Ireland, and the gradual fading of the Armada from a current event into distant memory. Now it sits within the echoes of polished footsteps and the low murmur of visitors marveling at Dromoland's beauty, its presence as understated and steady as ever. Yet its journey still feels unfinished. Its story continues to pull at those who stumble upon it, asking them to imagine seas long quiet and storms long forgotten. In the next room or the next hall, perhaps there are other objects with histories just as rich. But one thing is certain: few hold the same weight as the Admiral's oak table. Its scars and carvings are not just decoration. They are the marks of resilience, a quiet testimony to its passage through the chaos of one world and into the tranquility of another. This is less a final chapter and more another stop on a journey still unfolding. One destined to remain as mysterious and enduring as the shipwrecks that first brought it ashore. Could an inanimate object carry the weight of the past? It sounds absurd when you first think about it, doesn't it? After all, a table is just a table. Wood and craftsmanship polished where it needs to be, functional in purpose. But then, there's the Admiral's oak table. Its story isn't just carved into its wood. It lingers, heavy and quiet, in its presence. Sitting in the grand halls of Dromoland House now, far removed from the salty chaos of its origins, it feels as though time itself has folded into those intricate carvings. Every smooth corner, every subtle blemish feels alive with what it has seen. You can almost imagine its beginnings, can't you? Let's rewind the years, not to a place of domestic calm, but to the inside of a Spanish warship. Picture strong hands running over its surface as it was first crafted. The tools used, leaving behind faint patterns in its oak. It was likely shaped to balance beauty and resilience. Its heavy frame, built to withstand long voyages at sea, while still belonging to the polished world of power and authority. Sailors didn't sit at tables like this. It was made for command, for plans whispered, maps pored over, and decisions that shaped the course of history. Think about those moments. A single candle flickering, throwing light over its carved legs and clawed feet, while the Admiral traced a path across foreign waters, perhaps oblivious to the storms waiting ahead. This table must have held countless memories during its days at sea. Memories now imagined because the voices that once filled its space have long since gone. There's something sobering in that thought. The first time the Admiral leaned over it, his plans were full of confidence. A march across the English Channel, a victory that would echo across Europe. And the last time, maybe it was as waves began to batter the ship, crashing against the sides with a violence that rattled the planks beneath it. The genteel calm of those early days dissolved, replaced by chaos. You can almost hear the boots stomping across the floor. The creaks as the ship groaned in the raging storm. The table stood through that, as steady as it could be. even as the sailors' hands that once rested on it gripped ropes and rails instead, hoping against hope that the sea might have mercy. Of course, the sea didn't. When the Armada's great plans dissolved in the salty chaos of wind-swept waters, this table found itself cast out of its intended place. No longer a centerpiece of strategy, it became one more piece of debris. But even then, you can picture it differently from the rest of the splinters and shattered hulls washing ashore. It wasn't just another plank. Maybe the carvings on its legs shone briefly in the sunlight as it bobbed in the surf, or maybe it clung to a jagged rock, its edges worn by the relentless motion of the tide. Imagine being the first person to spot it, its sturdy frame far too large and intricate to go unnoticed. Did it look like a relic of grandeur reduced to a physical reminder of failure? Or did it already carry that strange feeling of resilience, a sense that it shouldn't have made it but did? Now, as it sits undisturbed in the calm halls of Drummerland House, its details are easy to get lost in. The carvings are faint in some places, softened by the slow erosion of age. Yet, their presence still speaks of the care and artistry poured into its making. The clawed feet remain striking, their curves drawing the eye downward to the floor, as if steadying the weight of everything the table has survived. Its surface tells another story. Run your hand across the wood now, and you'd notice how smooth it is, with only the very slightest imperfections. Tiny cracks, indentations, or faint scratches left there like whispers from every person who touched it over the years. These marks don't take away from its elegance. They add depth, making it feel lived in, as though its story has been physically etched into its skin. And then there's the silence of its current home. Drummerland is far from quiet in the literal sense. The house echoes with footsteps, conversations, and the occasional soft clink of glasses in the distance. But the table itself holds a different kind of silence, the type that pulls you toward it. If you stared long enough, your mind might begin to imagine the things it has witnessed. It has outlived its original purpose, its original people, and even the ship that once carried it. Yet it still stands, unshaken, bearing all the weight of what it has endured without saying a word. There's comfort in that kind of resilience, isn't there? To survive the storms and chaos of the past and find a steady place to simply exist. Artifacts like the Admiral's oak table offer something rare and intangible. History often feels distant, a faded photograph or dry text that struggles to feel real. But objects like this close the gap, offering you a tangible connection to events and lives that feel otherwise unreachable. Standing near it, one doesn't just think of the Spanish Armada as a failed naval campaign. You think about the human side of it. The sailors scraping by on salted fish and hard biscuits. The officers pacing quarters filled with thick, humid air. The sheer exhaustion that must have overtaken everyone when endless waves rolled without mercy. You can almost see their hands brushing its surface, not in triumph, but in the thick of uncertainty, desperation, even defeat. It transforms something abstract into something concrete. It's fascinating to think about why some artifacts survive while so much else is lost. The Spanish Armada left a vast legacy of wrecks scattered across the coasts of Ireland and Scotland. Yet what remains is fleeting. Shards of wood, rust-eaten cannons, faint memories of stories passed down in whispers. And then there's this, a table, intact, preserved across centuries, and still recognizable as the same object that once witnessed the final hours of Spain's great endeavor. Its survival feels almost deliberate, doesn't it? Not just an accident of circumstance, but something that insists on its place in history, as though its mere presence carries a message that words alone can't capture. The table may never reveal its full story, but that doesn't stop it from sparking your imagination. You trace the craftsmanship. You ponder the faint ridges left behind as its edges were shaped. You tilt your head, listen to the stories told about it, and wonder what's missing. Are there names we've lost to time? Sailors who may have leaned tiredly against it? Commanders who sat straight-backed around it? Scribes hunched over its surface, penning orders they hoped would lead them home? The table doesn't answer. It holds its silence, but invites you to wonder. That's the true legacy of artifacts like this. They connect us, through centuries of salt-stained history, to lives that were both worlds apart from ours and eerily familiar. The Admiral's Oak Table is a reminder that history isn't just about winners, leaders, and disasters. It's about the quieter things too. The hands that built, touched, and preserved what the sea tried to take. Sitting in Dromoland House, surrounded by the gentle hum of a world far removed from its own, the table still feels alive. It rests there, not forgotten, but not celebrated loudly. A piece of the past waiting patiently for those willing to pause and consider its journey. And so, as your mind lingers on it, you start to realize the table is more than just furniture. It's a bridge, a steady connection between the storm-driven chaos of the Armada's final days and the calm reflections of the present. It's not just a story of survival. It's about persistence, about finding meaning and memory in what could so easily have been lost. This table carries not just the weight of history, but the weight of everything we've chosen to remember from that history. It reminds us that even the quietest artifacts, those that sit still and speak only in their carved resilience, still carry echoes of humanity, centuries strong. But what of the other remnants of the Armada? What became of the ghost ships still claimed by the sea? Or the unknown debris that the ocean continues to guard like its own secret treasure? That's where the story pulls us next, into the drifting fates of the other vessels, and the mysteries they left behind. What became of the other ships that vanished into the storm? That question has hovered over the Spanish Armada's history ever since the last mast cracked under the weight of the ruthless North Atlantic. Ships are not meant to simply disappear, but for those that did, the ocean became their only witness. The so-called ghost ships of the Armada, a name as much legend as fact, are the remnants of that fateful campaign that no map can track and no sailor's log can fully explain. They are ships that slipped through the usual boundaries of history, vessels lost to violent weather and shifting seas, only reappearing in fragments or stories whispered on lonely coasts. The storms of 1588 were relentless, driving the Armada's surviving ships far from their intended course. Those that weren't immediately shattered against jagged cliffs or swallowed whole by the waves drifted aimlessly at the mercy of currents they couldn't fight. Imagine one of those ghost ships in the days after the storm. Its sails might have hung in tatters, flapping weakly in a wind that had finally calmed. The deck, slick with salt water, was likely strewn with broken barrels and scattered ropes, signs of the chaos that had engulfed it. Every plank would creak with exhaustion, the sounds echoing across an empty stretch of grey sea where the horizon seemed impossibly far away. The sailors who remained, if any by this point, were trapped in an impossible situation. Weakened from days of fighting the storm, starved, their fresh water spoiled by seawater, they would have struggled to make sense of their location. Compasses were unreliable after such chaos, and the stars, their ancient guides, were often obscured by clouds even after the worst of the weather passed. Some of them must have stayed silent during these moments, too defeated to speak. Others may have muttered desperate prayers, their voices low, barely audible over the gentle slosh of water against the hull. Those ships became drifters, wandering aimlessly across the North Sea and the Atlantic, lingering like forgotten monuments, slowly unpacked by nature. Some reports suggest they were spotted weeks or even months later. Strange and silent vessels bobbing in the distance. One harrowing account describes local fishermen spotting a Spanish vessel, its sails slack, its decks empty. Upon boarding, they found the remains of the crew still aboard, their bodies stiffened and pale, faces tilted upwards as if waiting for a sign that never came. Whether this story is true or folklore passed down and altered by time is hard to say, but it captures the aura of isolation that surrounds these ghost ships. They were survivors in the loosest sense, and yet their endurance was meaningless. They drifted further from their origin, further from rescue, until the sea claimed them entirely. And the sea is relentless with what it claims. Wreckage from Armada ships has washed ashore in small scattered pieces over the centuries, worn so smooth by time and water that it's easy to forget it was hand-cut, hand-assembled. But some notable wrecks have been uncovered. Take, for instance, the remains of the San Marcos, dashed against the rocks in County Clare. The San Marcos was thought to be one of the strongest vessels in the fleet. A ship of war built for confrontation, but undone by relentless storms. When pieces of it were later found, the strength of its construction was undeniable, even in its ruin. Iron fittings were pried from the remains, and its timbers were scavenged for anything useful to the people living along the coast. Other Armada wrecks tell stories that are stranger, almost quiet in their mystery. The La Trinidad Valenciana, another vessel lost to the Irish coastline, was like a skeleton unearthed centuries later. When archaeologists began to study the wreck in the 20th century, they found personal belongings scattered among the ruins, things that spoke to the small, everyday humanity aboard such a grand undertaking. Imagine pulling a shoe from the mud, its leather remarkably preserved, and thinking not just of who wore it, but where his journey ended. What beach did he wash onto? Did anyone know his name? Artifacts like these make these ghost ships feel less distant, the decks less empty. But not all remnants have been uncovered, and not all mysteries have been solved. While wreck sites like Spanish Point and Strida inform much of what we know about the Armada's ending, no one has catalogued everything the storm stole. There are vessels that left no trace, not in local graves, not in drowned timbers, not even in stories carried forward by coastal communities. These are the true ghost ships of the Armada, entirely unaccounted for. Their fates hidden somewhere deep or pieced together, only at the water's edge. You might wonder how something so monumental could seemingly disappear. But think about the North Atlantic itself, its unpredictable swells, its shifting sandbanks, endless in its power to churn and consume. Over the centuries, people have reported sighting Armada wrecks years after the catastrophe. There are whispers of ships seen adrift near the Hebrides, their tall masts cutting dark shapes against the gloom. Some accounts detail eerie encounters with crews still aboard, sitting unnaturally still, their gaunt faces a warning that no one dares approach too closely. And here's the part that makes these stories so compelling. Even as much of the Armada's material legacy has been retrieved, cannons, coins, carved wooden decorations, the idea of these ghost ships endures purely because of how thoroughly they exist outside explanation. Were they abandoned and left at the mercy of drifting currents until they splintered into nothingness? Did they run aground somewhere unreachable, swallowed by soft sands or crushed under craggy cliffs no one bothered to search? Or are there still remnants lying somewhere in silence, waiting for human hands to find them? The stories surrounding these ships inspire more than curiosity. They touch something deeper. They're not traditional ghost stories, not the kind built for scaring children or told by candlelight. Instead, they're about the unsettled sense that history, even when it's written, is never complete. Ghost ships represent the gaps, the parts of the past that refuse to stay ordered or pinned down. Their silence is what pulls people in, the need to know what happened when the storms came down. Consider, for example, the amazing discovery of an Armada wreck off the coast of Donegal in the 1970s. Locals had long whispered about a ship lost in those waters, but it wasn't until divers braved the icy depths that La Girona emerged once more. A Spanish galleass laden with treasures from other wrecked vessels, attempting to ferry survivors northward to Scotland. Its wreck offered not just another piece of the Armada's reality, but a glimpse into desperation. Men clinging to a last hope that the sea dismissed without effort. But not every vessel will have such a discovery. And that's where the ghostly nature of these lost ships takes hold again. The mystery fuels why their legend endures more than their physical remains ever could. You can picture them in your mind long after the words fade from memory. Hulks of wood barely afloat, drifting when no harbor waits to take them in. They are abandoned, not just physically, but by time itself. Even now, as the waves rise and fall over the places where these wrecks were lost, there's a sense that not everything is gone. Fishermen still report strange sightings. Shapes in the mist they can't name, or fragments of wood tangled in their nets that seem impossibly old. Marine archaeologists follow every lead, though many end up scratching their heads, left only with small planks or half-faded bits of rigging. And still, the ghost ships stay out of reach, as if they belong not to us, but to the sea. It's tempting, isn't it, to romanticize these vessels, to wonder if their silence has a purpose? Maybe it's not tragedy, after all, but something akin to freedom. Perhaps they've escaped the confines of history, leaving behind the weight of ambition and empire to drift eternally. There's something powerful in that thought, though it's likely no comfort to the souls who once called those ships home. The crew's voices, their shouts in storms, their murmured final prayers are long gone. But the idea of the ships themselves, haunted not by spirits but by mystery, lingers in its own way, as vivid and intangible as the fog rolling off the Irish coast. And so the stories continue. The Armada may have fallen, its ambitions humbled by nature's raw power, but its ghost ships remain. They exist in fragments of memory, in artifacts scooped from the ocean's depths, and in fleeting glimpses that keep history just out of reach. Whether they'll ever all be found isn't the real question. What matters is that their presence reminds us of how much the ocean takes, how much it guards, and how much it leaves to legend. As much as we search, we may never truly know the fates of every ship that vanished beneath those stormy skies. The sea, as always, keeps some secrets for itself. What do the remnants of the Spanish Armada teach us about the passage of time? At first glance, they might seem like simple objects, wooden planks, rusted cannons, bits of rope. But the truth is, each piece carries a story. When you hold something saved from that wreckage, it's more than just an artifact. It's a surviving fraction of the human experience. A quiet reminder that history isn't just about grand battles and sweeping movements of power. It's about the small, tangible things. The things people touched, used, relied on, and sometimes left behind. The Armada's artifacts tell two stories at once. On one hand, they're symbols of failure, of Spain's broken ambitions, and the futility of human plans against the sheer power of nature. But on the other, they're symbols of endurance. Each object that made it through the chaos of 1588 represents a kind of survival, a way of saying, this mattered enough to outlast everything else. Take something small, like clay jars recovered from the wreck of La Trinidad Valenciera. These jars once held olive oil, a small necessity for cooking or preserving food on long voyages. It's almost mundane when you think about it. What could be simpler than a jar? And yet, there it is, dragged up centuries after it was tossed into the ocean, carrying not just oil, but a little piece of daily life aboard an ill-fated ship. It's in these little fragments of the ordinary that you start to feel the weight of time. In contrast, there are the grander relics like cannons raised from the remains of the famous La Girona. These are heavier in every sense, not just in their mass, but in what they represent. Cannons spoke of war and power, of a fleet armed to conquer England and pave the way for Catholic dominance. Finding one in near-perfect condition years later is uncanny. You're looking at a machine that was once meant to make a battlefield roar, yet now sits quietly in a museum, stripped of its initial purpose. The duality is striking. These cannons, impressive and imposing, couldn't protect the fleet they were built for, but they've survived in a way those ships and men didn't. Then there's the Admiral's oak table. Unlike a cannon, or even those clay jars, the table walks the line between ordinary function and extraordinary symbolism. It's just a table, designed to hold maps and goblets and elbows. It wasn't a weapon or a survival tool, yet its survival feels almost poetic. With its clawed feet and intricately carved patterns, the table once belonged to a world of privilege and power, a commanding presence, even in the cramped quarters of a ship's cabin. It likely supported the weight of the Spanish Armada's ambitions, serving as a platform for plans that extended far beyond the creaking timbers of the ship itself. And yet, the table outlived those plans, enduring not because of what it was used for, but because someone decided it was worth saving after everything fell apart. These relics, whether they're massive and imposing or small and personal, draw you into the lives of the people who use them. It's impossible to stand in front of the admiral's table and not wonder whose hands shaped its surface, who traced a finger over its carvings, pausing to think, plan, or even absent-mindedly fidget during a tense meeting. The table invites those questions, but it doesn't answer them. Like all the objects salvaged from the Armada, it keeps its secrets while quietly connecting you to the people who once surrounded it. Think about the sailors, ordinary men who didn't have the luxury of sprawling maps or sturdy oak furniture back in their cramped sleeping quarters. They might have caught a glimpse of that table through an open door, but their world was entirely different. Their artifacts, when discovered, paint a humbler picture. Archaeologists have discovered shoes from the wrecks, stiffened but still recognizable centuries later. Imagine that. Shoes once tied tightly by a young sailor preparing for a mission that promised glory, now preserved in silt and salt, telling the world he existed long after his name has disappeared. These small personal items remind us that the Armada wasn't just a grand fleet. It was a collection of people, each with a role to play, each with objects they relied on to live out their days. And then there's the symbolism, the weight these objects carry beyond their material presence. The Admiral's table, solid and unbroken, represents more than just survival. It speaks to the fragility of human ambition and the resilience of the things we create. This was a table made for war, a functional luxury meant to serve a powerful commander. Now, it shares none of that original context. It simply exists, weathered and calm, having traveled through chaos, loss, and centuries of change. It's a reminder that even the most carefully laid plans, even the greatest expressions of human power, can crumble under a sudden storm. And yet, some things persist, not to conquer, but to endure. The table sits today in Drummerland House, removed from the violence that initially surrounded it. The same hands that carried it from the wreckage understood that history doesn't just survive on paper. It survives in objects like this. Things that were there when it all unfolded. It's become something both ordinary and extraordinary. No longer confined to the high ambitions of an admiral's cabin. The table has become a witness to centuries of quiet history. It's changed hands, been admired, preserved, and protected, and yet it still carries the mystery of its first life at sea. But it's not just the table that holds meaning. Consider the burial places of the Armada's drowned sailors. Temple Na Spanik, for instance, stands as a quiet marker for what's been lost. There are no ornate gravestones, no detailed records of who rests there. The site isn't a treasure in the material sense, but it feels like one in its simplicity. It reminds us of the human cost of these events. The sailors who weren't remembered with reclaimed shoes or sturdy tables, but with the earth itself. These burial sites, like the Armada's artifacts, connect us to something profoundly human. They carry the weight of resilience in a different way. Not in survival, but in how we choose to honor what was once here. It's fascinating how people interact with these objects and places today. When you visit a museum or walk along the cliffs of Spanish Point, it's easy to feel a sense of distance, a barrier between then and now. But when you see a piece of the Armada up close, when you touch the cold iron of a cannon, or run your fingers along the faint carvings of a table, that distance collapses. You realize these were real things used by real people, not just names in a history book. The Spanish Armada isn't just a grand story of storms and battles. It's smaller than that, more intimate. These artifacts remind us that history is made up of individual lives, lives filled with objects that matter to them, objects that now matter to us. And maybe that's the real legacy of the Spanish Armada and its lost treasures, the sense of connection they create. These objects endure because they link us to the people and stories of the past. Each item, whether it's as grand as the Admiral's table or as ordinary as a pair of shoes, represents a thread in the larger fabric of history. They help us see the human side of events that might otherwise feel too big, too distant. They remind us that the past isn't just something we read about. It's something we can feel, touch, and sometimes even hold. So as you think about the Spanish Armada, don't just remember the ships or the storms. Think about the small things it left behind, the quiet witnesses to everything the sea tried to swallow. These objects have outlasted their original purpose, carrying messages across time in a way that words alone never could. From grand relics like the Admiral's table to the humble belongings of anonymous sailors, they prove that survival doesn't always look the way we expect. Sometimes, it's not the people or the places that endure. It's what they left behind. And in that sense, the Admiral's table becomes more than just an artifact. It becomes a symbol, not of power or naval ambition, but of time itself. It represents how fragile our plans are and how persistent the stories woven into objects can be. It sits quietly now, no longer commanding a warship, but still commanding attention, still inviting reflection. And as we follow it into the final chapter of its journey, we'll see how a single table, weathered and enduring, reflects the broader themes of resilience and memory that define the story of the Armada. Imagine holding on to something that survived centuries, an artifact built for function but charged with meaning. The Admiral's oak table is exactly that. From the chaos of the sea to the stillness of Dromoland House, it's a quiet reminder of how history clings to seemingly ordinary objects. Its wood carries the weight of storms, decisions, and survival. Now, take a look around you. What objects in your daily life could outlast you, telling your story to someone else centuries from now? History starts small. A table, a tool, a thought. Let it remind you how much meaning can linger in silence.